In the southeast of Zimbabwe, there's a city built entirely of stone. Walls as tall as a 4-story building made of around 1 million granite blocks, stacked without a drop of cement, and still standing after 700 years. For 100 years, the experts who came to study it were stuck on one question. Not how was it built or who lived here. The question was, surely Africans couldn't have built this, so who did? They blamed the Queen of Sheba, the Phoenicians, ancient Egyptians, even Atlantis, anyone but the African people living right beside it. And when one archaeologist insisted on the truth, his own government forced him out of the country. I research African history, and I went back to what the archaeologists actually found in the ground. Today, I'll show you who really built Great Zimbabwe, how we know, and why so many powerful people needed you to believe a fairy tale instead. Let me take you to the southeast of modern Zimbabwe. There's a steep granite hill there, and wrapped around it and across the valley below, a whole city built out of stone. Not mud, not timber, stone. Hundreds of thousands of granite blocks, cut to size and stacked into walls as high as a 4-story building, with not a drop of cement holding any of it together. Just stone resting on stone, fitted so carefully it's still standing after 700 years. The grandest part is called the Great Enclosure. Its outer wall curves round for about 250 meters, longer than 2 football pitches laid end to end, and rises up to 11 meters high. Something like 1 million blocks went into that one wall. To this day, it's the largest ancient structure anywhere in Africa south of the Sahara. On the whole continent, the only thing bigger is the pyramids of Egypt. Inside it stands a strange, solid stone tower about 10 meters tall, shaped a bit like a giant grain bin. Nobody's quite sure what it was for. A symbol of the ruler's wealth and power, most think. A full granary meant a strong ruler here. Others read it as a symbol of fertility. We don't know for certain. The place is called Great Zimbabwe. The name comes straight from the local Shona language, Zimba za Mabwe, houses of stone. And it isn't the only one. There are more than 400 of these stone Zimbabwes scattered across the region. This is simply the biggest. That's why it's the Great One. At its height, 600 or 700 years ago, this was a city. Thousands of people living, trading, worshipping, herding cattle. The whole site spreads across about 1,800 acres, more than twice the size of New York's Central Park. So hold that picture, the hill, the great curving wall, a stone city humming with life. Because for the better part of 100 years, powerful men looked at all of this and refused to believe Africans could have built any of it. How they refused and what they were willing to destroy to keep that refusal alive is one of the strangest and ugliest stories in the whole history of archaeology. Here's the first thing worth knowing. When Europeans first heard about this place, some of them actually got it right. Portuguese traders wrote about the stone cities of the interior back in the 1500s. And they recorded that the local people called these buildings a word that meant court, the seat of a ruler. So right at the start, the truth was simply reported. These were African courts. The fairy tale came later, and it arrived with a name. Karl Moak, a German explorer who reached the ruins in 1871, hunting for gold. Moke took one look and decided the place was far too impressive to be African, so he reached for the Bible. He decided he'd stumbled on Ophir, the legendary land of gold that in the Bible supplied King Solomon. He found an old wooden beam on the site and convinced himself it was cedar from Lebanon, like the wood in Solomon's temple. It wasn't. It was ordinary local hardwood. But the story was already walking out the door without him. And once it was loose, it grew arms and legs. Maybe the Queen of Sheba built it. Maybe the Phoenicians, ancient traders from the coast of what's now Lebanon. Maybe Arabs. The wilder voices reached further still. Ancient Egyptians, shipwrecked Vikings, even the lost civilization of Atlantis. Anyone at all, as long as it wasn't the African people living right there beside the walls. Now here's what turns this from an honest error into something darker. In the 1880s and 90s, a British businessman named Cecil Rhodes was seizing this very land for the British Empire. The whole colony was about to be named after him, Rhodesia. And a story that said Africans had never built anything here was worth a fortune to him. If that great stone city had been raised by some lost white race, then white men taking the land wasn't conquest. It was just coming home. So the myth wasn't only wrong, it paid. Keep that in your pocket as we go. When a lie turns a profit, people will fight to protect it. And protect it they did. This is the part that's hard to sit with. First came the looting. In 1895, Rhodes people set up something called the Ancient Ruins Company and handed it a license to dig the gold out of these stone ruins across the country. It tore through more than 40 of them. The gold ornaments were melted down. Everything else, the pottery, the everyday objects, the actual evidence, was tossed aside as worthless. At Great Zimbabwe itself, the damage got more personal. In 1891, Rhodes sent an Englishman named Theodore Bent to dig. Bent had no real training, and he dug straight through the ground around that stone tower, wrecking the layers that could have dated the place. Then, around 1902, a former lawyer named Richard Hall was put in charge. To tidy up the site, he dug out and dumped up to 2 meters of soil across the ruins. He said he was clearing away, his words, the filth and decadence of African occupation. Sit with that for a second. The soil he was shoveling out held the pottery, the tools, the proof of who lived there and when. He threw the answer away. Archaeologists have been working around that missing layer ever since. And then the lie became law. In 1965, the white minority government of Rhodesia, led by Ian Smith, broke away from Britain. By now, Great Zimbabwe had become a rallying symbol for Black Zimbabweans fighting for their freedom. So the government simply decided what the truth was allowed to be. Guides at the site were told not to tell visitors that Africans built it. School textbooks, museum displays, radio programs, films, censored. One archaeologist who worked there, Paul Sinclair, later spelled it out. He said a member of the museum's board threatened him with his job if he stated publicly that Black people built Great Zimbabwe. He was allowed to say yellow people built it. He was not allowed to mention the radiocarbon dates. The hard science, forbidden. And the man who paid the steepest price wasn't an outsider at all. He was the government's own monuments inspector, a white Rhodesian archaeologist named Peter Garlake. His own research showed plainly that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona. The government, right up to Ian Smith himself, leaned on him to stop saying it. In 1970, when it was demanded that he give equal weight to the theory that pale-skinned foreigners built it, he refused. He resigned, and he left the country. Driven into exile for telling the truth about a wall. So let's just settle it. Who built Great Zimbabwe? The honest answer had been sitting there for decades, for anyone in power willing to hear it. Back in 1905, a meticulous archaeologist named David Randall McKeever excavated the site properly. Everything he pulled from the ground was African. The homes, the objects, all of it. No Phoenicians, no Sheba. He concluded the ruins were medieval and African in every detail. Then, in 1929, came the person who shut the door for good, a British archaeologist named Gertrude Caton Thompson, leading one of the first major excavations directed by women. She worked with real scientific discipline, and she reached the same verdict with no wiggle room left. Great Zimbabwe was built by African people. And not in some impossibly distant past. In the medieval centuries, the same years, Europe was busy raising its cathedrals. Later science only hammered it home. Radiocarbon dating, a way of measuring the age of old wood and charcoal, placed the city's rise and its golden years between roughly the year 1100 and 1450. People went on living there for a good while after that. The builders were the ancestors of the Shona, the same people who live in that region today. And Great Zimbabwe wasn't even the beginning. To the south, an earlier African kingdom called Mapungubwe was working gold and building in stone a century before. Great Zimbabwe grew out of a long local tradition, generation after generation of African builders getting better and better at it. These were rich, connected people too. Dig in the ground and you find Chinese porcelain, Persian pottery, glass beads carried across the Indian Ocean. Great Zimbabwe traded its gold and ivory all the way to the coast and out into Asia, centuries before any European set foot there. And its sculptors carved soapstone birds so striking that one of them stands on Zimbabwe's national flag to this day. Even the stonework gives the game away. The walls lean very slightly inwards for strength. The blocks are sorted by size and laid in clean, level rows. That's not a fluke. That's expertise, a craft handed down and sharpened over generations by people who knew exactly what they were doing. When the country won its independence in 1980, it took its name from the stone city itself, Zimbabwe, a whole nation named Houses of Stone. The people who'd been told for 100 years that their ancestors built nothing reclaimed the greatest building in the region as their own. But here's a turn I didn't see coming when I started reading. One of the foremost experts on Great Zimbabwe today is a Zimbabwean archaeologist named Shadrach Chiri Kure. He grew up about 60 kilometers from the ruins, and he says that at school he was taught almost nothing about them. He didn't even visit until he was 22. And Chiri Kure notices something uncomfortable. The old colonial reflex, he argues, never quite died. It just put on new clothes. These days, people love to explain Great Zimbabwe's greatness through its trade with outsiders, the Arab coast, the gold buyers, the foreign luxuries, as if the city only mattered because of who it did business with. And he asks a question that lands hard. How is that really so different from saying foreigners built it? We've just swapped foreign hands for foreign influence. So his life's work is to turn the story back around, to read Great Zimbabwe from the inside, to understand it through the people who actually raised it and what it meant to them. Because to the Shona, this was never just a fortress or a marketplace. It was sacred ground, a place where the ancestors are present, where people came close to the divine. It still carries that meaning now. So, what's true about Great Zimbabwe? It's real, it's vast, and it's African. Built and flourishing between roughly 1100 and 1450 by the ancestors of the Shona, with a skill so sure that the walls are still standing 7 centuries later. The Queen of Sheba never set foot there, neither did the Phoenicians or the Egyptians or Atlantis. Those were stories invented by people who wanted the land and found it easier to erase the builders than to admit what those builders had made. A gold-hunting explorer lit the myth. An empire found it profitable. A breakaway government banned the truth outright and drove its own archaeologist into exile to keep it buried. And it took until the 1980s for the people whose ancestors raised those walls to be free, in the open, to call them their own. That's why a place like this matters. It matters because of the people who were actually there, the ones who quarried the granite and balanced those stones by hand. For the better part of a century, that one simple fact was the single thing the powerful could not afford to say out loud. Subscribe, and I'll see you at the next one.